Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Oops. Need to turn it on. Works better that way. There we go. Okay, continuing in the Sermon on the Mount, we're continuing into chapter 6, into the middle part. When I look back when the boys were small, we would keep our holiday plans simple, usually a cottage or a hotel in a city or in a region that we could explore for the week. That was sort of our plan, the way we did most of our holidays. And I'm sad to say that now, years later, when I hear the kids tell, oh, are we up yet? There we go. When I hear the kids tell the stories now of our holiday trips, they don't remember Parliament Hill. They don't remember the white sands of Lake Erie. They don't remember Universal Studios or any of the other fancy places we went. They don't remember the whales that we saw off the Gaspé Peninsula. Instead, they remember the TV shows they discovered while channel surfing in the rooms that we had. You see, we grew up not having cable, and before streaming services, we watched TV off an antenna and watched whatever DVDs we could borrow from the library. But when we were on holidays, the world would open up into this amazing world of possibilities. We would discover an absolute gem, it seemed, every year on holidays, something we'd never seen before that just blew our minds, and we would watch whole seasons of it over a week while at the cottage. And so that was where we learned about Cash Cab. We saw Cash Cab one year and watched seasons worth of it while we were at a hotel. Or another time we discovered Paranormal Home Inspectors, which has continued to be a favorite of Liam's ever since. And Swamp Mysteries. I won't even summarize that. It's so dumb, I won't even get into it. Canada's Worst Driver was a favorite that we have since discovered is also streamed on various services. We've enjoyed that one. But the best one we ever found is probably Storage Wars. Now, I must confess, I think I learned about Storage Wars from Dwayne. He had kind of tipped me off on this one about 10 years ago now. But we watched like a whole couple of seasons of Storage Wars while in a cottage in Quebec. It's a reality TV show, if you can call it that, where a bunch of storage locker prospectors bid on lockers without inspecting the contents of it and see if they can turn a profit. It's kind of like Antiques Roadshow meets, like, I don't know, pro wrestling. It's sort of a combination of the two. And it's the kind of thing I can't describe. Maybe it would be best if I just show you. And so turn up the video.
Ran me up to $1,100 on this locker. Now I'm just trying to stay positive and see if I can even get my money back. Okay, I'm just kind of stacking. Grab that suitcase there, girl. This one.
That one a little heavy?
Yeah, this one's got something in it. Let's see what's happening here.
Check it out, huh?
Bunch of costume jewelry.
What's
I don't know, dude. This is looking really good. This is not looking like costume jewelry at all.
How do you tell the difference?
Let me see here. Let me take one of these out and look at the carbons and stuff in the sunlight. Dude, that's got a lot of sparkle, man. I think we're into the real deal. Woo!
Let me see it.
These rings are looking good. As long as it's not some costume jewelry from some burlesque show, I might beat the house this time. Vegas, baby. I'm taking all the jewelry to a local jeweler. I don't know if it's worth $5 or $5,000, but I'm about to find out.
Wow, they didn't put a year down. Shame on them.
What is that?
It's a calendar on a heart, and there's a diamond in it. Need you to pay very special attention to this piece, okay?
Is it that nice of a piece?
Very nice piece.
You know, he keeps writing down numbers. I'm hoping this stuff is worth so much that he can't even keep track of it.
That'd be totally it for you, okay? The bracelet, this one is 14 karat gold with diamonds. That's about 2,000. You got the studs here.
Awesome.
They're 500.
Nice.
This heart, solid gold, with the diamond on the calendar is about $500.
Yes.
This watch is $1,500.
Boom.
Okay. Then you got that Tiffany necklace, which is $1,500. Got everything together, came up to $17,000.
Yes!
Kidding?
Okay.
That's what I'm talking about. That's the wow factor, baby.
Okay.
That's the wow
All right.
factor.
Okay, thank you for your indulgence. So we found with the show, the characters were entertaining and it was fun to watch. Good old Barry sometimes catch a break and find something in a locker that was worth something, and it was just such a delight to watch Dave Hester take a bath on a dumpster full of rubbish. It was fascinating to watch the show and see how what would appear to be a pile of junk, literally forgotten treasure in these storage lockers, and watch them turn them into like tremendous value. Like it begs the question, why would you collect 400 G.I. Joe figures and leave them in the boxes? What a bunch of garbage, until you learn that each one of them's worth about $100 to $150. Then you realize that your parents threw out about $2,000 worth of toys when you went away to university. And it was also interesting to watch the kind of things that people would store up. If you were going to have a locker and you were going to pay a monthly fee to keep that thing, what kind of things would you fill it with? What kind of stuff would you pile up and store up in these storage lockers? Sometimes these treasures from 30 years ago are virtually worthless now and are just simply dragged out of these storage lockers and thrown into a dumpster. While other times, what would look to me like garbage is then taken out and appraised and valued at thousands. And it makes you wonder, where is your treasure? Where is your treasure? And how do you keep it? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches us against this kind of tomfoolery. Starting here in what Amanda read this morning in verse 19, Jesus delivers a warning to his followers using vivid language and metaphors and even a riddle. Jesus wants his disciples to understand one very important lesson, that followers of Jesus need to disentangle themselves from their possessions. And so over the next 2 weeks, we're going to spend some time in this little paragraph here in the Sermon on the Mount. This week, we're going to look at a warning about treasure in the verses that Amanda read. And then next week, we're going to talk about the warning about the single eye and the warning about serving two masters. The first part of this, though, is simple. Jesus simply tells us, don't store up treasures on earth. And the operative verb here is to store up. And so the idea behind that verb is the idea of to treasure something, to reserve or stockpile it. You've got this picture of collecting or amassing, heaping up, accumulating all these treasures. Jesus says, don't store up treasures on earth. And then he gives us a reason why. Why not do it? Well, hang on. Before we talk about that, though, it is worth pausing to observe what Jesus is not saying. Before we go any further, Jesus is not saying don't store up or save up money for a rainy day. Jesus is not saying that you shouldn't plan for your retirement. Jesus is not saying that you should not prepare for expenses and not save to make big purchases. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's saying don't pile up earthly treasure. Don't get attached to your physical earthly belongings. Jesus continues by telling us why. Don't store up treasures on earth. Why? Because they're temporary. You don't store them up because they don't last. You might think of them as valuable and things worthy of a lot of attention and time and passion and energy, and then just find that they literally fall apart and they disappear. James, the brother of Jesus, seems to be deeply impacted by these words. In a number of places in the book of James, we hear echoes, if you will, of the Sermon on the Mount. Like James has heard something and it's kind of rung in his ear and it's kind of continued. He says at the beginning of James chapter 5, now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that's coming on you. Your wealth is rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages that you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence, and you have fattened yourself for the day of slaughter. Martin Luther famously said, the great idol Mammon, which we'll talk about next week, has anointed 3 trustees in this world: rust, moths, and thieves. The moral of the story is things don't last. They're temporary. Physical possessions have their place, of course, and they have their purpose. We can use the things that God has blessed us with and use the assets that we're left in charge of. We can take these things and we can do good with them, or we can do evil with them. It's not necessarily the things that are evil, but it's the way that we hold them, and it's the way that we use them that becomes the problem. Things aren't necessarily the problem. It's just the way we see them and the way we use them. Now, Jesus is eminently practical in what he has to say. He says, don't store up earthly treasures, but instead, in verse 20, he tells us, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. And so, the big question is, of course, how do you do that? How do we store up treasures in heaven? So it's a weak analogy, but I've got this. I have a checking account and a savings account, right? But then I've got a US dollar account that I used to use more often than I do now. It's an account that is literally in US currency. And so when I make a deposit to that from Canadian, it's converted, and then it lands in US currency, and it sits there in US currency until I spend it, use it in a US transaction, or I transition it back to Canadian. Now, it's fun and kind of sad to watch the different relative currencies come and go. As the US dollar climbs and the Canadian dollar drops, that the value of money that was sitting in that account goes up and down, even though I've done nothing. It just has to do with the currency exchange. Now, I might think of these changes as being significant or big, and if you're planning a trip to the States anytime soon, you've probably bought U.S. currency and discovered the huge, significant difference in dollar to dollar. A U.S. dollar is worth barely 70 cents Canadian right now. But this is peanuts compared to other currency problems and issues in the world. Robert Mugabe is the president of Zimbabwe, if you can call it that, kind of a dictator sort of for life. In the late 1990s, Zimbabwe suffered from what's called hyperinflation due to the disastrous fiscal policies of Robert Mugabe, the president. Now, when the government began running out of money, they just printed more. So you might think, oh, shoot, this is a brilliant idea. He did. You might even think it's similar to what Trudeau did during the COVID years. But no, what Mugabe did was way worse, way, way worse. Now, Jim or Steve or Roger might be able to explain to you how this works. But a currency's relative value collapses when you just start pumping new money into the economy, causing higher and higher inflation. Now, I'm not talking about 3% or 4% or 5% inflation. Over 20 years, the Zimbabwean currency experienced inflation of 90 sectillion %. That's a 9 with 20 zeros after it. They kept printing new denominations of money because the ones they had became so worthless, and by the time they had printed them, they were worthless, and they needed to do more. In 2008, for example, they created a $100 trillion bill, and it was worthless in no time. Basic goods became unaffordable overnight. And I read a story about a high school teacher who was afraid for his pension, and so he cashed it out, thinking that would be one way to try and capture the value. It was enough to buy a small house. And then overnight, the currency collapsed so much that by the next morning, when he went out to do something with the money, all he could buy with it was a loaf of bread. Many people lost everything in the collapse. The super wealthy, though, abandoned the Zimbabwean currency and converted it into US dollars, which kept their value. They put their money where they knew they weren't going to lose it. They didn't leave their money in something that was going to be temporary and then ultimately worthless in no time at all, but they instead stuck their money in an economic sense in a place that was not going to lose value. In 2009, in fact, the government abandoned its currency altogether, and they now use a US dollar or the South African rand as the currency in their country. Now, if we use this metaphor, what Jesus is telling us this morning in the Sermon on the Mount is, don't store your treasures up, treasures that become worthless, but instead store up treasures that last. So how do we do this? First, we need to consider what really lasts. The psalmist would tell us to, Lord, teach us to number our days so that we might gain a heart of wisdom. And another poem that came to mind this week is written by C.T. Studd, and it says, 2 little lines I heard one day traveling along life's busy way, bringing conviction to my heart, and from my mind would not depart. Only one life 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Since ancient times, good deeds were thought of as treasures. Good deeds were thought of as an investment, something worthy of hanging on to. During the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, a scribe named Baruch wrote, "Behold, the days are coming, and the books will be opened in which are written the sins of all those who have sinned. And moreover, also the treasuries will be brought in, together the righteousness of all those who've proved themselves righteous." Now, the question of one's motivations comes up. Doing good deeds just to pile up sky treasure it seems kind of self-defeating, right? The heart seems to be still wrong in this equation. It's more than just doing good deeds, though. The Apostle Paul makes this really simple. At the end of 1 Corinthians, what does he say? Faith, hope, and love. These three remain after everything else, but the greatest of these is love. Love is the thing that lasts. Acts of love are the treasures that do not spoil or fade. Deeds of love are what lasts into eternity. Good deeds done in love are never truly forgotten. Jesus says they are stored up in heaven. Many good deeds don't cost any earthly mammon, so to speak, while some cost money and others cost time. One more thought from Jesus here is helpful. In trying to imagine this kind of treasure, Jesus reminds us at the end of verse 21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, careful with that phrase, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We often get it backwards. We think it runs the other way, that where your heart is, there your treasure is. In other words, the way to find out where your heart is to look at your bank account, follow the money, that sort of thing. And while there might be some truth to that, that's not what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying our hearts follow our wallets. Jesus is saying we can train our hearts by the way we spend what we have, both in time and in money. We're training our hearts through our activities. I've experienced this in a number of ways in my life. I care now more about Indigenous Canadians in remote northern communities, having visited one, having met the people and heard their stories and spent my own money sending gifts and help. And if we want to make investments in heavenly treasure, if we want to pursue justice in the way that we treat people, if we want to seek wisdom instead of knowledge, and if we want to live a life of peace, I think it might start with putting some money and putting some time where your mouth is, so to speak. Biblical scholar Craig Keener says, or helps us with this direction of simplicity. He writes that if disciples of Jesus really trust Jesus, they will live as if treasures in heaven really matter. A number of years ago, I went to a funeral of a man many of you probably know. And it was ironic that at the funeral, this man, technically speaking, owned nothing. Dead men tell no tales, and also legally speaking, they don't own no property either. But there were many witnesses that day that spoke and shared stories of this man's generosity. Of his moderate wealth, he gave much. But what was remembered even more fondly at his funeral was his gifts of time. Volunteering at church, volunteering in the community and at local public schools, at summer camps, even small acts of kindness. If this man's wealth was measured in friends, this guy was a billionaire. His kindness and his generosity gleamed like treasure. It could even be seen from as far away as here on earth. I'm sure you've heard about the wildfires in Southern California. Julie and I have some friends that live on Pepperdine's campus, and they've been through a really tough couple of weeks. The university has survived so far. The buildings on the property remain intact, but many of their friends have lost everything in the fire. The words of books like Amos that we'll talk about this morning in our adult class literally come to life on our news feeds and in the newspapers. This week, she posted a poignant video that captures the spirit and the kind of wealth that Jesus is talking about here. And so as I close, I'd like to play that clip. So can you turn the video volume up? It's an edited video. It's 90 seconds long, and it's punchy. There's a lot there, so you need to follow carefully.
What did you love and lose in the fire?
I lost everything. From a guy with everything to nothing. I spent my whole life helping people. And I didn't think it would happen to me, but it did. But I have my health and my life. About 10 or 12 years ago, I was going home, going up late, and I see this person sitting on the bench shaking, which I knew him anyway, because I coached him when he was in high school. He says, "Where's your jacket?" He says, "Coach, I don't have one." I said, "Okay, put that." I ended up giving all of my jackets away. A lot of people helped me when I was a kid, so that makes a difference. I used to have a sporting goods store. Then I started giving away shoes because when I was going to elementary school, I prayed many days because my shoes had holes in them that it wouldn't break. So, it's short of money, I give them the shoes anyway. The young man today drove at least 200 or 300 people to see their houses, and I offered to give him some money for gas. He says, "No, I won't take it, Walt, because you wouldn't take it." Maybe he's gonna be my replacement, which wouldn't be bad, you know? I'm one of these dumb guys think you can save the world. I would think that way till I die. I've been knocked down before, but not like this. Times are tough, but I'm not giving up.
What did you love and lose?